Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Pod Save Chocolate. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm your host, and today we are going to be talking about a new announcement, which is the organization of something called the UK Cocoa Coalition, and specifically about the relationship between the UK Cocoa Coalition and something called the UK Forest Commodities Regulations, right? And how the UKFRC, the Forest Commodities, FCR, Forest Commodities Regulations, I may have put this backwards everywhere, FRC rather than FCR, for which, wow, that's my bad. But we're also going to be talking about the relationship between the UKFCR, I'm going to have to remember to say that, and the EUDR. All right, but before we get into that, a quick note that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by the members of the Chocolate Life. This is the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. It's live. You can go there. And if you're not a member, you can click on the join button. There's always a free membership level. But if you do have the financial resources to support the work I do, memberships begin at as little as $5 per month. Also, what you can do during the course of the episode is you can go into the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, the live chat, or in the comments on LinkedIn and Facebook, and you can let me know where in your world you're connecting from. But if you have a comment or a question about anything I'm going to be talking about today, you can get it up in the comments. And with that, let's just dive in today because there's a lot to cover. So for every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, I put together a post on the Chocolate Life. Here is today's post. If you want to, and you have a second monitor or a second device, you can click on the QR code, which is on the left of your screen above my head, and you can go and follow along on another device while you're listening or watching here, just to make it easier for you to do that. And with that, let's get into today's topic. So, number one, I didn't know I was going to cover this until yesterday, when all of a sudden the announcement of the UK Cocoa Coalition just hit my feeds. There were articles in Confectionery News Magazine, Confectionery Production Magazine, International Confectionery Magazine, an outlet called EDI, which I wasn't familiar with, and something called the Business and Human Rights Center. So these are just four of many, many, many outlets. If you were to go to Google News and type in UKCC, you'd find lots of announcements about it. And so I was curious what this was about, and I opened it up and I looked at it, and what I found was what I think is something which is very, very similar to the recent announcement of something called Together Cocoa, which I've talked about in a previous episode. And so Together Cocoa is a coalition of 5 companies: Hershey, Mars, Mondelez, Nestle, and one other whose name escapes me at the moment. Big companies that are looking to focus on living wages for cocoa farmers. That's their primary focus, living wages. How do we secure living wages for cocoa farmers? But it was an announcement of a foundation, right? And at the moment, we don't know anything about that foundation. We don't know who its executive directors are. We don't know anything about its governance structure. We don't know anything about Together Cocoa. And if we take a look at, for example, this article from, let's go to Confectionery Production. If we take a look at this article from Confectionery Production, excuse me, I know it'll take a couple of seconds for it to load. Hardly an exclusive in terms of reporting, although there is some specific analysis by Neil Barston, who is the editor of Confectionery Production. There is some independent output. But basically what they're doing is they're straight reporting what the UK Cocoa Coalition is all about, or what they claim to want to do. And let's go back and take a look at that. So what I did was I created a series of, it turns out, 8 topics. And I went through all of the reporting that I could get my hands on yesterday, including some history of topics I had covered in the past, specifically the EUDR, and together cocoa, to the extent that it's on the Chocolate Life. And what to do is I answered a series of questions. So the first thing is, it is the Forest Risk Commodities Regulations. It is the FRC. I'm sorry. I forgot a word, risk commodities. So what are the UK Forest Risk Commodities Regulations? Okay, so the UKFRC, right, is a regulatory framework, a regime, right, that is currently been proposed. It was proposed almost 5 years ago now, I believe 2021, right, that the UK Parliament said we need to do something, right, and maybe it was Brexit FOMO, now that the UK is no longer part of EU and technically not directly beholden to the EUDR regulations because they're not in the EU, the UK said, well, we better do something about that, right? We better do something that that incentivizes businesses that are domiciled in the UK that manufacture or process specific forest commodities. We better do something about it to sort of be in line with, our pre-Brexit neighbors, right? And so what is it doing? The Forest Risk Commodities rules, right? It's a due diligence regime. So there are rules that say you as a company need to do X and Y and Z in order to prove that you are compliant with this set of regulations that we're putting together, right? And the target is illegally produced forest risk commodities. And we'll get to what those commodities are and what illegally means in this context, because it turns out what the UKFRC means by illegal is different from what the EUDR means by illegal. So we'll get there. Okay, so, right, so what is the UKFRC? Right? The UK Cocoa Coalition, who are its members, and what is its mission? Okay, the UKCC was launched around in the International Day of Forests, and it was announced in the UK Parliament, right? That's for my reading of what's going on, right? Members include major chocolate manufacturers, Barry Callebaut, Ferrero, the Hershey Company, Tony's Chocolonely. I think Tony's Chocolonely is misidentified here. They're not a chocolate manufacturer. Barry Callebaut manufactures the chocolate for them. Tony's Chocolonely takes the chocolate, makes the bars. In that sense, they are a manufacturer, but they're not a chocolate manufacturer, primarily a marketing company, in my opinion, right? So there's one group of people, a couple of major chocolate manufacturers. None of them are headquartered in the UK, although the UK is the world's third largest. My understanding is the UK is the world's third largest market for chocolate, right? United States is number one. Maybe all of EU is number two, right? But we don't have any chocolate manufacturers who are headquartered, UK Cocoa Coalition members who are chocolate manufacturers who are headquartered in the UK. Numbers of a couple of large UK retailers, so Sainsbury, Marks & Spencer, Waitrose, some prominent NGOs, and prominent is not my language here, it's pulled out of other reporting around this. So the Rainforest Alliance, the Fair Trade Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, the International Cocoa Initiative, which is, I don't know why, so it turns out that even the International Cocoa Initiative is among this, the World Cocoa Foundation is not. Right, so the Cocoa and Forest Initiative and other initiatives like the International Cocoa Initiative are heavily influenced by World Cocoa Foundation membership. Right, so one of the things, so others are, IDH, the Voice Network. There are other NGOs that are members of the UK Cocoa Coalition, and of these, I'm looking at them, and I don't think any of them are domiciled, headquartered in the UK. It's just the retailers that appear to be UK corporations. Just, it's interesting, right? And we can take a look at that a little bit further on. One of the things that I want to go and just point out, if I can, right, is that there are webs of potential conflicts of interest, right? In the sense that just off the top of my head, we can say that, oh, the Hershey Company is also a member of Together Cocoa, right? And many of these companies are right closely allied with the International Cocoa Initiative, the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, the World Cocoa Foundation. Some of them financially support the Voice Network, right? Again, Barry Callebaut manufactures the chocolate for Tony's Chocolonely. None of these relationships are disclosed, right? And one, for example, that first came to mind is that a gentleman by the name of Anthony Fountain. I've interviewed Anthony Fountain here for an episode of Pod Save Chocolate. We've met in person at CHOCOA, as well as did a live interview at a conference in London in 2024, 2023, 2024. So I know Anthony. And am familiar with his work and the work of the Voice, what the Voice Network is trying to do. But he is also an advisor to the Be Slavery Free Chocolate Scorecard. And that relationship, the fact that Anthony is also on the Voice Network, is not disclosed on the Chocolate Scorecard website. It turns out that none of the affiliations of any of the advisors, right, to the Be Slavery Free Chocolate Scorecard project actually have their affiliations publicly identified. And so there's this web of relationships. I'm not suggesting that there are going to be actual conflicts of interest, but there is a potential for differences of opinion on what should be done and how it should be done, and can that affect the decision-making processes of these different organizations? I'm going to say it's quite a possibility. So before we go on to the next point, a quick, from Neil Barston, who's the editor of Confectionery Production. So for the record, I wasn't the only one to cover this, but was among the first. Neil, absolutely, if you're still watching, right? So I saw at least a dozen different outlets, right, cover this. All right, you may have been the first, don't know. But certainly the UKCC sent out their press release of their announcement to a lot of people. And I did an analysis, and there are overlaps of word for word taking out of that press release among most of the outlets that I saw that covered it. So exclusive is niggling, I get, but right, it's what. So first to go live with it, and some of my own content is in there. Yes, absolutely. One of the things, Neil, I did point out to is that you have some independent analysis from the perspective, from your perspective, the perspective of confectionery production, and that analysis is lacking from others of your UK-based competitors. So I just wanted to let you know that the coverage in Confectionery News is more straight reporting of the release, although Donna Eastlake, who's the editor there, did throw some things in, whereas International Confectionery did not. So I hope I acknowledged, yes, there is some stuff that you did. I think that this has been in the works for so long. For people really are not too sure what it represents, that's been 4 to 5 years ago now, and it's been in the freezer ever since. Absolutely. So we talk about the UKFRC, the Forest Risk Commodities regulations. 2021, I believe, is when it was introduced into Parliament, and it's still not, and the enabling regulation, so the regulatory framework underneath it, has not been enacted by Parliament. And this is one of the explicit things that the UK Cocoa Coalition wants to do. It wants to lobby Parliament, wants to lobby regulators to do this soon. Right, so that's definitely what the UKCC is about to do. It will be interesting to see whether government actually does take action on this and puts the legislation into act. I agree with you. So the UKCC is essentially a lobbying organization. They're lobbying the government to do some things that the government has been talking about for quite some time. And there's always the question of whether, the government is going to go, yeah, we're going to do that. We are going to do that. Or they're going to say, they're going to punt it down the road for another 10 years. Who knows, right? So there is that. So essentially, the coalition itself is not neutral, right? So it is explicitly calling on the UK government to, A, bring the UKFRC into force swiftly, and, right, and this is the UKCC position, align the UKFRC closely with the EUDR, including a strong deforestation-free standard. We'll get there, right? And this is new, use the UKFRC as a lever to support things that are not in the UK, the original proposal for the UKFRC. In addition, they want the UKFRC to address farmer livelihoods and human rights violations, in addition to tackling illegal deforestation. So, right, and then there's this framing, this may be your framing, Neil, I don't recall, is that sustainability is no longer a competitive differentiator, but an industry baseline. I agree with that statement, and it should have been a part of sustainability in the broader context, as not in terms of the UN SDGs, but in the broader context, should have been front and center from the signing of the Harkin-Engel Protocol in more than 20 years ago, right? But it is a normative statement from industry and civil society that regulations like the UKFRC are becoming table stakes, right? And from the UK Coalition's perspective, because it is a single issue, the UK Cocoa Coalition, right? Particularly for cocoa. All right, so let's get it. So the UKFRC and the EUDR, right, have some overlap around forests and deforestations, but they're fundamentally very different regulatory regimes. They have different intents. They have different commodities that are affected by the regulation, different enforcement mechanisms, and they have different regulations about who is going to be compliant, who is covered by them is probably a better way to say that. So number one, all right, and this is a challenge that I see. Number one is that whoever is drafting the UKFRC in the Parliament needs to be aware of all of the challenges that were faced through the adoption and eventual implementation of the EUDR, because there have been significant changes to the EUDR which water it down significantly. It's far less a draconian regime now than it was 3 years ago. Right. And so whoever is drafting the UKFRC needs to go and take a look at what the EUDR was intended to do and how the legislation changed over time, and address the specific challenges that trying to craft legislation like this imposes upon the people who are drafting it. It's really, really important. And then also to make sure that whatever the UKFRC is doing, it doesn't represent a fundamental conflict with what the EUDR is trying to do. It should complement what the EUDR is trying to do. For example, might it be the case that anybody that is EUDR compliant is already FRC compliant? The UK Cocoa Coalition may say no, because the EUDR is about deforestation. It's not about farmer lives and livelihoods. So it's going to be a real interesting thing to see how the actual legislation that gets written navigates this understanding of how the EUDR failed in its original drafting, what it has become, and the fundamental differences between what the EUDR, the UKFRC are about, and what the UKCC, the UK Cocoa Coalition, is going to be advocating for, right? A very, very different regime, right? So number one, the UKFRC, right, has a illegal deforestation focus. Notably, the UKFRC is built around local legality. Is deforestation legal or illegal in the producing country? Right? So that's very, very different from what the EUDR says. It says no deforestation whatsoever, whether it's legal or not in the producing country, and that deforestation has to have happened after a particular date in 2020. At the moment, the UKFRC is the enabling legislation has yet to be drafted, and so we have no idea if there's going to be a similar, before date. Right? It's okay, and after this date, it's not okay. But there are fundamental differences in that the EUDR combines an absolute deforestation cutoff, the 31st of December 2020, right, with a legality requirement. Products must be deforestation free, mean that they cannot come from land deforested, right, regardless of whether that deforestation was legal locally. Whereas the UKFRC says that UK businesses must not use commodities if they are produced on land used or occupied in violation of local land use or land tenure laws. So these are two very, very, very different things. And so it could be that technically something that is EUDR compliant could be UKFRC compliant, but something that is UKFRC compliant may not be EUDR compliant. Just so you know. So if you are a company that's doing business in the EU, you're a company that's doing any kind of processing or business of any of the affected commodities in the UK, you need to be acutely aware of those differences. So it's going to create some really interesting supply chain management and traceability challenges to make sure that these things are separated in a way that can be documented. And this is on top of all of the supply chain traceability issues which are currently done. So there are some differences in terms of what the covered or in-scope commodities are going to be. So the UKFRC says cattle products, beef, leather, but not dairy. So if I'm running a huge dairy operation in Brazil on deforested land, that's okay, right? But it might not be okay. So it says beef, and so cattle products, beef, and derivatives, it's not ambiguity in the legislation, right? It's like here in the United States, the House creates a bill, the Senate goes to the bill, looks at that bill, adds amendments to the bill, so it has to go back to the House for compromise and to figure out if there's a way to make sure both of them happen. It's not clear how these differences in what the commodities cover specifically, right, are going to be able to be reconciled. And so that's a huge thing. Again, will the people who are drafting the UKFRC care, right? Will they? The answer is, I hope so, yes. So hopefully they're not drafting their legislation without consideration of what the EUDR means. But again, the UK Cocoa Coalition's focus is on cocoa, and cocoa is just one of the 5 commodities which are covered by the UKFRC. The EUDR also covers coffee and rubber. So those are 2 different commodities, which are not agricultural commodities, which are not covered by the UKFRC. So maybe there will be some scope creep in that respect. So it's hard to know, right? Again, as Neil pointed out, Neil Barston, who's the editor of Confectionery Production, we have no idea, right? If legislators are even considering drafting the legislation, or, will members of the Green Party, all right, be leading the drafting of as opposed to members of the Conservative Party or the Labor Party? I mean, it's complicated, as you might imagine, right? There's also a difference in terms of who must be in compliance. So who must be in compliance? In the UK, for the FRC, it targets large, high-volume UK user, which are defined. Large, right, is threshold of global annual turnover of 50 million pounds. In terms of EUDR, that's a tiny, when they say small, medium enterprise, SME, right, 50 million pounds of global turnover, that's tiny. So technically, right, the UKFRC actually affects a much larger group of people, a much larger group of companies as a percentage of companies in business than the EUDR does, right? For cocoa companies specifically, the volume threshold is 500 metric tons plus a year. So you're processing more than 500 metric tons a year, you have to be in compliance. If you are less than 50 million pounds and you're processing fewer than 500 tons or less than 500 metric tons of cocoa, you can apply for an exemption, but the exemption isn't automatic. You must apply for it. And the covered activities include producing, manufacturing, processing, distributing, selling, supplying, or purchasing covered commodities and derivative as a part of your UK commercial activity. So what that says, if cocoa comes into the UK in transit and you do not sell any of the derivative products, right, that you're processing in the UK, all of your companies are international, you are still required to be compliant under the UKFRC. So just it's important to understand. So what that might be do, a big company might say it's not worth the additional regulatory overhead in terms of reporting and compliance and due diligence and all that other kind of stuff to actually do any of this manufacturing in the UK anymore. It's going to be cheaper to do it someplace else. That's a potential downside of this that needs to be taken a look at. So with the EUDR, it applies to operators and traders placing commodities and products on or exporting from the EU market. So it's a different group of people. There's no turnover or tonnage de minimis, right? The boundaries are easy. In reality, what's going to happen is that regulators are going to look at only at the 10 or 11%, I believe that number is, of the largest companies who do business in that country, and then they're going to do audits on just some of them. And then anybody who is caught in an audit is going to be subject to more regular auditing of what it is that they're doing. But there's no hard cutoff, right? It's really the size of your operation. And it depends, for example, in the EU, even though this is an EU regulation, member states will be able to figure out how they want to implement these regulations. And so a big company might say, well, it makes more sense for us to import our product into Portugal and do all our work in Portugal because they have an easier regulatory regime than if I were to import the product into the Netherlands and do the processing in the Netherlands. So it's going to be a really, really interesting, dance to see how all that gets covered. Got another comment from Neil Barson. Again, Neil, great that you're listening. Thank you very much. I mean, I need to let everybody know that Neil and I have been corresponding on this topic since yesterday, and I even responded to one of his comments this morning just before we went live because I thought it was important. So great that you have brought this up, Clay, as UK Cocoa Coalition confirmed that it will try and align with UDR, but there are going to be some real challenges, you say, especially as the UKFRC is a separate set of regulations that may or may not be entirely compatible. Absolutely, right? And so, Neil, you and I have, so Neil and I, as I say, have been corresponding back and forth on this over the past day. And I am far more cynical than Neil appears to be. And I have to respect that. Neil is, the editor of a publication that requires the active participation of industry. And so his what he can say is largely bounded. And this is true of all of, so it's not just confectionery production, it's confectionery news, it's international confectionery, it's Kennedy's confections. It is, even to some extent, Cocoa Radar. I mean, they're all dependent upon having access to these big companies for what it is that they're doing. And they're just physically constrained by that set of required relationships. And I'm not constrained by that set of relationships. And so I can be a lot more cynical. So Neil, what I would say about this comment, what I'm going to say about this comment is that every member of the UK Cocoa Coalition must be aware of these challenges, right? That they can lobby as hard as they want to force, quote unquote, force. They can lobby the parliament to speed run UKFRC regulations. And we all know that speed running drafting regulations leads to great things always, right? But they have to understand that the idea of the UK Parliament doing a good job of aligning the FRC with the UDR, especially given the background associated with Brexit negotiations, right, is this small. And so part of me says this is entirely performative, right? This is about these companies, Waitrose, Marks and Spencer's, Barry Callebaut, Tony Chocolonely, all the NGOs. A large part of me says that they know that this is a long shot, and that they're engaging this is performative. And for the NGOs, it means give us money so we can fight the good fight. Again, I'm being cynical, but I can, given the nature of the way NGOs are funded, it's going to be part of their fundraising efforts to say, we've got this new UK coalition, UK Cocoa Coalition, and we need you to support our efforts to fight the good fight. So it's going to be used to raise money. And that's a point that I actually cover further on. So I am more cynical than you, and I believe I shared my cynicism and the depths of my cynicism with you earlier this morning, and gotcha. All right, so let's go back to what I posted. And by the way, all of the notes that you're seeing in yellow and other colors on this page, right, that I'm paraphrasing for this, are in the notes for today's episode. So you can go to the Chocolate Life, click on the card for today's post, and all of these notes are there. You can read them after the fact and follow along. If you're a member of the Chocolate Life, you can go down into the notes, the comments at the bottom of the page, and let me know if you agree or disagree, or if you have some other thoughts about what the potential impact might be. Please go ahead and do that. Just right. Yeah, it is limited to people who are members, and you have to be logged in, but there's always a free membership level. So let's go there. All right. So there's also enforcement, right? We need to think about that, because any kind of quote unquote, so one of the challenges with Hark and Engel, right, is not only was industry, right, regulating itself, so the foxes are watching the hen house, but there were no enforcement mechanisms. There were no provisions that says, well, if you don't, meet this set of KPIs by this date, you're going to be fined, or something, or there are no enforcement mechanisms. And so one of the challenges with the regulation and the reconciling of the UKFRC and the UDR is around this notion of enforcement mechanisms and what will happen. So we don't know anything about what's going to happen in the UKFRC because there's no enabling legislation. So we can only speculate. But people who have taken a look at this, and these include some of the non-industry people who've written about this. There's some lists. ED is one of them. The human rights business. Again, there are a number of sources which are listed up here. So ED, the Business and Human Rights Center. You can go take a look at that. So I may go put a list of some others if because there are several more. So there may be civil sanctions, which include monetary penalties, stop notices and enforcement undertaken, and possible publication of noncompliance. So a bad list, targeted criminal sanctions for some failures, and investigatory powers for the enforcement authority, which is expected to be the Secretary of State. They include entry to premises, inspection of records, potential seizure of products. But until the enabling regulations are enacted, we have no idea what the penalties are going to be, right, if you're not in compliance. Under the EUDR, member states must provide for penalties that are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive, including up to 4% of EU turnover. I got to fix that, confiscation and destruction. So, right, and if you want to know a little bit more of this, there's a post on the Hill Dickinson website that will give you an overview of what it is that's going on, including some key takeaways. So these are sources that I used in drafting all of the comments that are on the page here. I've also provided links to my most recent podcast about the EUDR, an older podcast episode of Pod Save Chocolate, which looked at the corporate sustainability reporting directives, a bunch of different regulations which are a web which are related to each other in the EU, which is alphabet soup. And then an interview I did about the EUDR with Anthony Fountain, who is at the Voice Network and is also Be Slavery Free Chocolate Scorecard Advisor. So before we go on to the next point, another comment from Neil. I think it's good to have a healthy dose of cynicism in any form of journalism, so keep on in line with your observations. I have no plans to stop, Neil, but thank you very much. I very, very much encourage, I appreciate the encouragement. I aim to be independent in my own writing, yes, so I agree that a lot of what you say on the topic, there still remains a lot of greenwashing in the industry, so unless these regulations, be they the EUDR or the new potential ones, are actually enforced properly, they become meaningless. Yes, absolutely true. And yeah, I want to be sensitive in one of the criticisms that I made. So for example, people may know I was the technical editor at International Confectionery magazine, and did so. So I wrote for them and they agreed to promote The Chocolate Life. When after some time, it became clear that I was providing more value to them than they were providing to me, I asked for some compensation, and the end result was I was part of a dismissal of all non-staff editorial resources, and we were replaced by other mechanisms, shall we say. So, LLMs were doing a bulk of the heavy lifting in international confectionery. That was, 18 months ago when I was let go. I don't know what the state is today. That's why I was dismissed, right? But again, if you're an industry magazine, Candy Industry Magazine would be one of them. Kennedy's Confections would be another one. You're all dependent upon having intimate access with these companies, right? And I know what it's like because it happened to me when I no longer had access to the ear of like the global VP of marketing at Barry Callebaut, right? Or the global VP of innovation at these companies, or even, being able to stand right next to the CEO of these big companies and ask them questions. So that hasn't happened in over a couple of years. Might not happen. It takes a pretty enlightened organization to invite somebody like me to a press event and pay all of my expenses to be there, and for me to not report straight what it is that they're going to be selling, but in what it is that they're introducing. Probably a better way to think about it. Okay, so let's talk about this. I did a recent episode. It was actually the March News and AMA episode, where I talked about the introduction of this new alliance called Together Cocoa. You can go to that episode. It's linked to below it's linked below, right? You can scroll down. So it turns out that there's only one overlap, right? So the Hershey Company is a member of both Together Cocoa and the UK Cocoa Coalition. So I think that's healthy. If there was a much greater overlap, what we're going to do is we're going to find a whole lot of challenges associated with the charters of the two organizations and how they overlap and how they don't overlap, and how a Hershey representative will talk about UK Cocoa Coalition in one breath and have to talk about what the Together Cocoa is doing in another breath. So we do need to be aware of that. But keep in mind that, again, we mentioned this before, the UKCC plans to lobby UK regulators to use the UKFRC as a lever to support farmer livelihoods, address human rights violations, and in the process of tackling illegal deforestation. So they're going to try to expand the scope of the UKFRC. That is their mission and goals, their lobbying goals, right? Whereas Together Cocoa is focused almost entirely, at least from what the reporting has been so far, that they're focused on farmer lives and livelihoods. So making sure that cocoa farmers have enough income to be able to have enough income, right? And here is a link from Confectionery News Magazine to the announcement about Together Cocoa. So if you want to, you can go take a look at that. So the next point: who is going to benefit financially, and who foots the cost of compliance? So when it comes to, and this is specifically related to the UKFRC and the UKCC. So number one, financially, the farmers are not going to benefit, right? Right, at all, unless, right, the UK Cocoa Coalition can lobby the UK Parliament members who are going to be drafting the legislation to expand the legislation to support farmer lives and livelihoods. Right? Unless the UKCC can do that, farmers are not going to benefit. Right? If we take a look at the UDR, right, who are the companies who benefited? All the companies who provided satellite data made tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. None of those companies are located in producing countries. We don't have satellite companies in Ghana. We don't have satellite companies headquartered in Cote d'Ivoire. They're all in the US and Europe and other places like that, right? So all of the large bits of the money are going to people, right, who are not companies who are not contributing directly to the lives and livelihoods of cocoa farmers. They're providing satellite surveillance data so that people are doing GPS plot level descriptions of farm boundaries, right, can map those GPS coordinates against satellite surveillance, which will show historically, oh, this was deforested and it's not new deforestation after 2021. Those companies made, I think the technical term is butt tons. They made a lot of money. So they also did it. Who else made a lot of money was the companies who provided the data centers and software which the EU member states had to put together, right, in order to be able to handle the volume of data that they were getting, right, from all these companies who were supplying their due diligence paperwork, right? And that's actually one of the reasons why there was huge failure in delays in the implementation of the UDR is because nobody thought what that would mean, right, in terms of how much capacity is needed in order to be able to handle the data and what tools we're going to be able to use to be able to mine the data. Now, I'm sure that we've got a whole lot of new AI tools which are doing a lot of that, right? If they're well trained and they're well written, but still, it's the companies who are providing the AI analytical tools and the data centers that host those platforms that made money, not farmers. So we need to do that. So farmers are not going to benefit unless specific targets that provide living wages are implemented in the regulations. And keep in mind that in a country like Ghana, where prices are controlled by COCOA, by the government, right? The UK government saying, here's a requirement that you pay your farmers X is likely to be illegal, right? Or if not illegal, unenforceable in a country like Ghana. So again, here's my point, is that all of the members of the UKCC must be aware of these challenges, right? And of the likelihood of, even if they do get living wage or farmer livelihood language in the UKFRC, it may be unenforceable. Right? So what is the mechanism for somebody who's in the UK who must conform to farmer livelihoods regulations in the UKFRC? What is the mechanism for being able to get living wages to farmers in Ghana? It may not be possible. I'm just saying. Again, one reason why I think the UKCC is mostly performative, right? Because the people who are members of it must know this. They must, well, maybe not Waitrose Market, maybe not somebody at one of the retailers, although they've been involved, and Neil, you will know this better than me because you're located in the UK. These companies are probably on top of these kinds of regulations and these kinds of issues because they have to market to their customers. So they know what organic means. They know what fair trade means. Tony's Chocolonely, I mean, the UK Ireland is one of their biggest markets. I know Barry Calabout has an office which is dedicated just to the UK and Ireland, a whole marketing group associated with it. So these people must know this. And so I got to wonder what's going on. Listen, and by the way, if you are in any of the companies that are affected, not affected, that are members of the UKCC, and you are part of the management of your company's participation in the UKCC, let me know. If you want to push back against me and you'd like to be interviewed and you'd like to be a part of a future episode of Pod Save Chocolate where we can have a conversation, let me know. You can basically say editor@thechocolatelife.com, send me an email there, become a free member of the Chocolate Life, right? Put I'd like to talk to you in the comments. I will know your email address because it's associated with the user's account, and I can get in touch. Please reach out to me. Neil, if you'd like to organize something for Confectionery News, let me know, right? My old editor, International Confectioner, is over at one of your competitors, and I may reach out to her about this. So anyway, right? Can the UK, because we've got a couple of minutes left, can the UKFRC, like the EUDR, be considered a form of economic imperialism? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? The UKFRC, the EUDR, the UKCC, any one of these, right, actors, individually and collectively, right, is perpetuating economic imperialism, right? And here's how. It's a bunch of actors who are not in producing countries. So I make the distinction. I don't like global north, global south, right? Developed nation, developing nation, first world, third world. There are value judgments in there baked into the language of first and developed and north are value assumptions. North is higher, it's above the south, first rather than third, right? Developed rather than developing, right? There are values assumptions baked in. And when you use that language, you're adopting, even if unconsciously, the assumptions that go along with the use of the language, right? So I use a producing country, a country where cocoa is produced, and a consuming country, right? A company that processes the cocoa where, right, they don't grow cocoa, they don't produce cocoa, right? So all of the actors that are involved in the UKCC, the UKFRC, most of the actors involved in drafting, I would say all of the actors involved with drafting the EUDR legislation, none of them are in cocoa producing countries, right? And so what they're doing is they're saying, after hundreds of years of controlling the market oppression, right, rooted in colonial, right, actions, going back to the discovery of the New World and the exploitation of New World resources. So 500 years or so, it is this group of actors who are not in producing countries saying, oh, after all this time, we finally developed some values, and all the actions that we've been doing, however they were motivated, are having a negative effect on the environment, right? And on whether or not there will still be cocoa farmers in 50 years, right? So we've developed this new set of ethics, right? So ethics is a social construct. Morality is an individual construct. The ethics could be, an entire society like the UK or the EU. But within that ethical construct, the ethics of the Netherlands might be different from the ethics of Portugal. Morality is an individual. Here's the sea of ethics that I sit in. Here is the way I interpret them. That's my morality. So there are no widespread, common, objective moral truths. Morality is an individual perspective sitting in a sea of ethics, right? That we're doing. But so what this can be seen as the UKFRC, the UK Coalition, the UDR, so Fair Trade Alliance, Rainforest Alliance, all the NGOs that are certifying good, right? What they're doing is they're trying to impose regulations and behaviors upon actors in producing countries without including them in the decision-making processes, right? So in that respect, the UKFRC and what the UKCC is doing are both qualify, from my perspective, as economic imperialism in action. Is it too little, too late? The answer is probably, right? We have yet to see whether or not the UKCC lobbying will be effective And even if it is effective in motivating the FRC to be the enabling legislation for the FRC to be enacted, there's no guarantee that any of what the UKCC wants to do to extend the focus to broaden the issues that the UKFRC is designed to address will in fact reflect anything the UKCC wants to do. So is it too little? Is it too late? Like the EUDR, the EUDR is not just too little, it's just wrong from the beginning. The intent, the motivations are interesting, but the way it was conceived and the way it was implemented it was the wrong thing, and probably also too late. It was politically expedient, and it was able to get consensus among regulators, but it was just, they really didn't think of any of the potential unintended consequences. The drafters of the legislation were blissfully unaware of what they didn't know about what they didn't know. And so they went ahead, did things that seemed to make sense, and it roiled markets and had an impact on thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions, of farmer lives around the world disproportionately, which is also another thing that needs to be done, needs to be considered. What makes sense, for example, as a premium in Cote d'Ivoire will be different than what makes sense as a premium in Ghana, because they have two different economies, and you need to consider what is the cost of living in both of those places. If people in Ghana say, well, if you want us to have 11 cents per kilo premium, and the people next door in Cote d'Ivoire, they get 10 cents per kilo premium, well, we're at an economic disadvantage because our stuff costs more, right? And so we will take the lower premium, even though it's against our better interests to do so. I mean, it's just, a lot of the way things like the fair trade premium and other premiums are negotiated assert what I think of as negative economic pressure, that they keep prices down, right? Including big buyers of cocoa and big chocolate makers in the negotiating process for the quote unquote fair trade premium makes sense, because these big actors are doing everything they can to keep the premium as low as possible, right? Why are they involved, right? Yeah, they're going to buy the cocoa, right? But they only buy a very small portion of certified cocoa right now. What percentage of cocoa that is certified fair trade actually earns the fair trade premium? I mean, this is one of the key metrics that we should be looking at. There's an organization called the IISD, right? International Institute for Sustainable Development. And they've done some really, really, really fantastic research and reporting on this notion. How much of products, not just cocoa, coffee and other things, which are certified, actually are sold and earn the premium associated with certification. And it is much less than 50%. So it's important to know. And then who ends up paying the cost of certification? The farmers do, because they're not recouping the cost of certification from all the cocoa they grow, only a small portion of the cocoa they grow, and they have to make up the difference unless they can find some NGO who is covering the cost. And all that does is it gets in the way of understanding what the true cost of production is. It's just a nightmare. Unintended consequences, people with good intentions who went into a complex system thinking there were simple answers, and thinking that, what we know about the way things work in Ecuador will work in West Africa, or what we know about the way things work in Cameroon will work in Sierra Leone or Tanzania or Venezuela or Peru or Bolivia. No, I mean, we would like simple answers, a one size fits all, right, solution, but the world is messy and it won't work that way, right? Is it and is it, meaning the UKFRC / UKCC mashup, is it the or even a right thing to do? And my opinion is probably not. It's probably not the right thing to do, right? Although politically it wouldn't make sense for the UK to adopt the EUDR by reference, or just wholesale take this scheme, right, and say, we're going to do that, right? Politically, it would never happen. Brexit showed us that is not even on the table, right? But What I am not confident of is of the people who are writing the regulations. If they've never been to a cocoa farm, they've never been to a rubber plantation, they've never been to a coffee plantation, they've never been and seen on the ground in like 20 or 30. I mean, they have to go to them in Africa, they have to go to them in the Americas. They have to understand, right, the day-to-day reality of what goes on in these places and the effects. Unless the people who are writing this legislation have that experience, they're not going to know, right? And I suppose you could say the UKCC is, oh, we'll provide that expertise for you, right? But they're not neutral actors. They're going to provide insight which only backs up what their interpretation of reality is. And so I don't trust them because I don't trust them to provide independent evaluation of these things because, again, they're not neutral actors. And then finally, Neil, I don't know exactly what you're quite agreeing to. Oh, I think this is entirely what is missing from the EUDR regulations and the latest UK deforestation law, a means to help ensure greater pay for farmers. Last year, farmers gained farm gate payment increases, but the governments in Ghana and Ivory Coast have just cut the payment significantly. So here's a point I was going to make this morning, Neil, on one of your LinkedIn posts, is that, oh, maybe one of the first things we should do is we should decommoditize cocoa. Take it off the commodities exchange, right? If the commodities exchange is what controls prices, right, then all this work that we're doing to try to, farmers' lives and livelihoods, as long as COCOA, right, is in 100% of control. They set the price of cocoa, what you pay to the farmer, right, who can buy it, right? You need to have a license. You need to be a licensed broker, a licensed buyer in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, right? As long as there's that level of control. I mean, one of the reasons why many farmers in Latin America were able to say, oh, the price of cocoa, and they're looking at their phones and they're going, oh, yeah, the cash price for cocoa on the commodities exchange right now is $11,000 a metric ton. Hey, you, right, buyer, I want $11,000 a metric ton because that's what the market price is, right? Maybe a slight discount, right? But what happened, as you point out, Neil, right, is that when the governments of Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana had raised the price above $4,000 a metric ton, the farm gate price above $4,000 a metric ton, and when the market crashed and the price went below the farm gate, the market price was below the farm gate price, that's a recipe for disaster, right? And so maybe the answer is decommoditizing cocoa and realizing, oh, that the cost of cocoa from West Africa is going to be different based on whether it was produced in Cameroon, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, or Ghana, or any place else. That the price of cocoa, right? We sort of understand this. I mean, there's an informal market, which is where most of the specialty cocoa is. It's tied to commodity prices, but it is not closely coupled to commodity prices in the sense that the commodity price sets a floor, but specialty cocoa is always going to be traded as a premium, and there's no formal market mechanism which tracks or influences the premium for specialty cocoa. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's the first thing we should be lobbying for, is decommoditizing these things. Do I believe it will ever happen? No, right? But at least it should be on the table, right? As you point out, the governments in Ghana and Ivory Coast have just cut the payment significantly. The farm gate price has to be below the cash price. Now, one of the things that the governments could do is they could peg the farm gate price to the market price, right? And when it goes up, right, when the market price goes up, the price paid at the farm gate price immediately goes up. I mean, the same day, right? And so that might be one thing that would help, right? Is to, if you're going to use the commodities markets to help regulate prices through hedging strategies, right? Then maybe tying the farm gate price to the market price and discount it slightly so that, hey, COCOA can make its VIG and all the intermediaries can make their profits. But rather than, having a meeting once every 6 months or to set the price for the next season, I mean, I mean, it's just really, really slow. So there are mechanisms that can be done to set the payment, right, with a minimum that says, here's what it takes per hectare of land at this level of production for a farmer to produce, to earn a living wage for 100% from their cocoa farming activities. You can't, as many NGO certifications do, it's not just their cocoa farming activities, but it's other economic activities. So cocoa farming might be 60% of their income, but there are other thing that they do that gain them the other 40%. And the entirety of that is considered to be a living wage. None of that. Cocoa Bod could say it costs $3.97 per kilo plus 20% for the farmer, and that's the price. That is the price. And next door it might be a little different, right? But we already deal with that with country differentials and all the other kind of stuff in the market. It's very, very complicated, is all that I'm saying. But maybe the first thing to consider is maybe change the way we do business, right? Maybe that might be. Don't do what they did in Trinidad, which is just to, like, one day there's a government cocoa board and the next day there is not, and prices collapsed because there was just chaos, right? Right. They've reintroduced a marketing board, which is different. They don't have pricing control. Their job is to support, and so the Ghana Cocoa Marketing Board does that for Ghana. So there are ways to address these things, but everybody's thinking, how do we do this within the existing system? And I think that you need to forget what the box is. Right? You need to forget what the existing system is in order to be able to make that. Some farmers unions have said they want to control taken away from the government, right? Do you think that could work yourself? So the answer to that is I am sure that there are instances where it will work. And I am sure that there are instances where the management of the union or cooperative, right, will take advantage of the situation and personally enrich themselves. I mean, one of the assumptions we make about fair trade is that, all of the premium is going to the farmers. That's not the case, right? The farmer is not paid directly. The cooperative is paid directly. The assumption is that these are perfectly democratic institutions, right? And that there is no corruption. There is no one in the system who is taking advantage of a position of power, right, to unjustly enrich themselves. And so it could happen. I mean, I think the way to do it, if we can, Neil, is more in line with what happened between the partnership with Coapa Cocoa and Divine, right? It's what Sean Eskenazi does with his profit sharing, is that the farmers are guaranteed a minimum price for what it is that they're selling, and they are able to capture a percentage of upstream value add. I've suggested, I had this idea, it's more like in 2012, for something I called 5% for farmers. And 5% was, not a literal term, but the notion is, Neil, you have in the UK a value added tax, and the VAT, cascades through the system. You come in at one point and there's no VAT, and then there's this whole set of transformation at the end. There's a VAT, right? And that VAT captures the value. Could we put together a VAT-like system, right, with traceability through the supply chain, right, where we could directly connect, this cocoa went from this farmer, and the farmer was paid, X dollars per kilo for that, but the person who sold it to a consumer made a 7X profit on that, and so some percentage of that cascaded down through the system. I mean, I've been an advocate of something like that for over a decade, right? And so I think that it will take people who are outside the system, or people so by outside the system, I mean, we're not in an NGO. These are people who have extensive experience, but don't have a fiduciary interest in influencing the outcome in any particular way. It also requires an enormous amount of flexibility to understand that, okay, what works in Ghana may only work in part of Ghana, won't work for the entire country. Would I say that, what goes on in northern Peru in Piura is the same as what goes down in the southern Peru, near Cusco, where Chuncho is, or in Junin, or in San Martin, or Ucayali. I mean, these are different parts of the country. I mean, even though they're the same country, they have different cultures. Like the United States. I mean, in England, you've got the South and the North, and they're different places, and they're different from Scotland, and they're different from the part of Ireland that is part of the UK. It's just a goal for simplicity, right? That simple answers to very, very complex questions that gets in the way. I think there are individual actors who do an extremely good job at this. I mentioned Sean Eskinosi, who I'm interviewing on April 10th, as part of the 20th anniversary of our first bean buying trip. But Neil, the answer to your question is, when we look at the UKCC, when we look at Together Cocoa, what we need to do is we need to look at, number one, who is actually hired on a day-to-day basis to manage these efforts. Where do they come from, right? That will be really, really important. For example, if Together Cocoa hires only industry veterans, there will be no new thinking, because everybody is, I've got to work within the existing framework, right? And so we're going to make perhaps incremental improvements, but the incremental improvements just are layered on top of layers and layers and layers of institutional memory and inefficiency. It's not going to happen if that works. You need to hire people to run these efforts who don't have that fiduciary responsibility in protecting the status quo. And Together Cocoa is about protecting the status quo. The UKCC is about protecting the status quo, in my opinion. Rainforest Alliance is, fair trade as much as they are about, farmer empowerment. They are ultimately about protecting a status quo, not the status quo. Right, wrapped in ideas about, idealistic pronouncements. And maybe that's cynical, maybe it's not. But that's what I see the challenges are when it comes to thinking about the UKFRC and the UK Cocoa Coalition. So before we go, I did point out that I did a link to my reporting. So this is the March News and AMA, where I did talk about Together Cocoa. I added a link to an article about Together Cocoa. It's here. And this is the post for today's episode. You can go to the post and you can find out all the resources that I used and that I presented to you today, without all of the background research that I did in order to get to it, and the time that I spent yesterday sort of examining these things and trying to figure out what I thought. No, not trying to figure out, but going through and thinking about this over the course of several hours, and then this morning over the course of hours, adding all the notes in. So I posted the questions yesterday, gave myself 12 hours to think about it, and then added the notes for today's episode. And you'll find the notes, right? So the questions are the bulleted points. These are the ones that I added yesterday. The notes are the ones that I added this morning. So you get an idea about my thought process and where things are. And that's the end of this episode. We went a little long. Remember that this episode of Pod Save Chocolate, like every episode of Pod Save Chocolate, is supported by the members. You can go click, let's go back. Here's the homepage of the Chocolate Life right now. You can click on the join button, right? Since 2008, January of 2008, when I spun the Chocolate Life up, there has always been a free membership level. You can join the community, support what we're doing. You'll get a monthly newsletter. You'll have the ability to comment on any post. And there's other members-only content that you can get to. If you do have the resources to become a supporter of the Chocolate Life, right, for as little as $5 a month or $42 a year, yes, I'm a big fan of Douglas Adams, you are able to support the Chocolate Life. Higher levels of support get you consulting hours. So if you want one coaching hour included in your membership, That's $150 for the year. Coaching hours are normally, if you wanted to buy them one at a time, they're $220. So you get a significant discount on coaching and consulting hours if you want to be a part of that. And with that, I don't know what I'm going to be doing for this Friday's episode. I know that we've got an episode upcoming. We're going to be announcing the winners of the Craft Chocolate Challenge. That's on the 14th. I've got April the 10th, which is my interview with Sean Eskenazi. Lots of stuff going on as the temperature starts to rise here in Arizona. But with that, everybody, I want to say thank you for your attention today. Again, if you have any questions, you can put in the comments right after the fact, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. I see all the comments that come across my desk. I will respond to them. Not live here, but in the comments when I do get to them. And then to also remind everybody that, even though these are really serious subjects that I'm covering and talking about, that in the end, it's chocolate, right? Chocolate is something that gives me great happiness when I work with it. It gives me great happiness when I share it. People who consume chocolate, when they consume chocolate, it makes them, for the most part, happy too. So remember, if you're working with chocolate and you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Until the next time, everyone, ciao.